Open your Bibles to Matthew 24, if you will. Matthew 24. I know we got several visitors here, and you haven't been here the last few weeks. So for you, you won't get necessarily all the context of this, but it still, of course, is useful. And in Matthew 24, the last few weeks, if you weren't here, we've been talking about heaven. We looked at several lessons about heaven from Revelation chapter 21, chapter 22. We then talked about hell, the only other alternative to going to heaven. And we talked about Judgment Day a little bit. And in those sermons, a couple of times I've mentioned Matthew chapter 24. And last week we spoke about the subject of premillennialism, which is a doctrine that says that Jesus failed his mission on earth, and that he's going to come back here to rule on a literal throne in literal Israel today. And we talked about how that can't be biblical. It's not biblical, not true. But in those sermons, I've mentioned Matthew chapter 24. And Matthew chapter 24 is really the foundation for, I don't know if foundation is the right way for me to use it. It is a passage that is used incorrectly to uphold that false doctrine of premillennialism and some others. If you've ever heard of the AD 70 doctrine, which basically says this in a nutshell, and I use nut in parentheses really. If you fall for this, unfortunately some have, that you're either in heaven or hell right now, okay? And so you can be in heaven, Davis can be in heaven, and well, I don't want to say anyone here is in hell, but the idea is that you're sitting, some of you are in heaven and some of you are in hell, and you may or may not know it, but this is it, okay? That final judgment came in AD 70. And it comes from, sometimes, a misunderstanding of this passage where they take things that are supposed to be figurative and they make them literal, and then they take the literal things and they make them figurative. It really messes with your mind. We're not going to go into all that today. Don't want to. But this passage of Scripture is abused by many. You've seen, and what's probably more common for each of us here, is you've seen where there have been in your lifetime probably several people who have said, we've predicted the end of time, right? You've seen it. You've seen billboards, right? And they'll say, look, there's signs, and you can see this sign, and you can see this sign, and you can see this sign. Therefore, the end is coming on this date, right? You've seen it. It's happened since this was written. So it's a misunderstanding of this passage. So what I want to do for this week and next week is I want to look at Matthew 24. And it's broken down into two big main categories. And to be up front, of course, we understand some of this is a little bit difficult to understand. But we can get the gist of it, the overall understanding of it. And this is important for you and me, okay? This is important for you and me because we have friends that will say to us, if you haven't had them say to you already, look, I'm seeing the wars and the rumors of wars. There's famines, there's earthquakes. Things are getting worse. So Jesus is about to return. I know brethren. I've had brethren say these things to me. Okay? So this helps us, prepare us to understand the chapter and help those around us. And I think it also helps to bolster our faith in the Almighty. So let's take a look this morning at Matthew chapter 24. Actually, let's give you a little bit of context here. For the previous couple of chapters, Jesus has been in the temple. He's gone in the temple. You remember where he chased out the money changers, okay? Chased them out because they were making God's house his place of business. He's chased them out. He left for a bit, stayed a night in Bethel, came back into the temple. And in Matthew chapter 23, you remember there is this long, scathing list of the Pharisees. You remember, woe, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. He's blistering them. I mean, really blistering them. Good, okay? And there's 8 different woes that he deals with. This is all in the temple that is taking place. And so when he gets done with this abradement of the Pharisees, verse 34, saying to them, the Pharisees, therefore, behold, I'm sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Now, stop here and think about this. As he's saying this to the Pharisees, I'm sending you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Would that include Jesus himself? Yes, it would. What about the apostles that are there listening and observing and watching their master preaching? Would it include them? Yes. All the apostles were prophets. Okay? So they're listening to this. And this is what he says. I'm sending you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Oh man. That includes him as he's saying it. And some of them you'll scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Listen to what he says. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon what? This generation. That's important. So what I want you to do is, if you're taking notes, circle this. That's Matthew 23:36. Circle these things, okay? You're taking notes. This phrase, down through chapter 24, especially the first part, is going to be important. All right? These things, okay? Take a note of it. You don't want to mark in your Bible, put it on paper, because you want to go back and look at this. Why does he say from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah? You may not necessarily understand why he says that. So what he's saying is the whole our Old Testament that goes from Genesis to Malachi wasn't necessarily arranged that way originally, and isn't in chronological order. Abel, we're all familiar with Abel, pretty much, Cain and Abel, right? And so Cain killed his brother Abel. When you look at Zechariah, you read about his death in 2 Chronicles. In the Hebrew Old Testament, 2 Chronicles is the last book of the Hebrew Old Testament canon. We rearranged it, okay? So basically we're going from the beginning of creation all the way until right up before this 400 years of silence, that happened between the covenants. So he's covering this whole span, and what he's saying is that you, Pharisees, your fathers, all your ancestors, all the way, they've killed everyone that God's sent, right? To try to help them and redeem them and teach them God's word. Okay, so that's what you're getting there. So all these things will come upon this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, verse 37, who kills the prophets, stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. This is Jerusalem, right? I say to you from now on, you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So this is all at the end of this scene in the temple, still in the temple here, okay? And these are all the things that the Pharisees heard and the apostles heard. Now, when we get to chapter 24, and remember this, chapter divisions, numbers, and verses were not included in the original text. Sometimes they can confuse us. This is a narrative that's continuing, okay? And so what we read in verse 1 is that Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. Now, that may seem awkward to us. Well, obviously, Jesus knows about the temple. He's known about it from the time he was a child, right? All the way through his life. What does this mean? They're pointing out the temple buildings to him. What they're showing him is the magnificence of the building, the great glory of it. They glory in the temple, right? Just like sometimes you and I look at great architecture and we marvel at it, except this had a deeper meaning. Their faith really was in the temple, okay? And the beauty of it. If you were to read history, especially when you look in Josephus, right? There was so much gold, they say, within the temple that when the sun hit it just right, you could see it for miles away. Apparently, it must have been a beautiful structure to behold. So they're glorying in the temple, okay? Now, as is often the case with all of us, we see one thing, think one thing, and Jesus says and thinks another thing, right? It reminds me of the Isaiah 55 passage. Behold, my ways are not your ways, and my thoughts are not your thoughts. as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my thoughts higher than your thoughts. It reminds me of that. So they're glorying in the temple, and he says to them this. This had to be a shocker to them. Do you not see all what? These things? Circle it, because it's going to become important later on. Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. Now you think about this. Your whole life has been focused around going to this building and worshiping God and serving God. And this is a place where who's going to sit one day and reign the nations. Their idea of the Messiah is, we've got one wielding a sword sitting on David's throne, and this is where he's going to rule from. And now all of a sudden, the one that they thought was going to be that says, this whole place is going to be razed. It's going to be leveled. There's not going to be one stone left that's not going to be destroyed. Now my world's upset if I'm a disciple, right? I mean, I'm really shaken here. So they go across to the Mount of Olives. When you're sitting on the Mount of Olives, you could sit there and you could look across and you could look at the temple. Okay? So they go across to the Mount of Olives, verse 3, and the disciples come to him privately and they say, tell us, when will what? These things. Circle it. When will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming in the end of the age? So they're asking some questions. And some people will say there's 2 questions here. Some will say there's 3. You can argue that. It doesn't really matter. The way Jesus breaks it down for us, we know we're getting a couple of questions answered. In their mind, the end of an age would be what? The end of this Roman rule to where the Messiah is going to sit on a throne. That's what they're thinking. Again, Jesus is going to rock their world here. Okay? He's going to tell them something different. So he's answering a couple of questions. Okay? And they want to know, and pay attention to this, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of your age? So, verse 4, Jesus answered and said to them, notice how he begins it. See to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. So from the get-go, his warning to them is, make sure you're not misled. Make sure you're not fooled. Now this is going to come up again over and over in this first part of this passage, in the first part of this chapter, okay? But he's warning them. The very first thing he says, make sure no one tricks you, okay? There's going to be a lot of people come, and they're going to tell you they're the Messiah. Don't believe it, all right? He'll mislead many. Some are going to fall for it. Verse 6, you'll be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for what? Those things, circle them, must take place. But that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things, circle it, are merely the beginning of birth pains or labor pains, okay? This is the beginning. Verse 9, then they will deliver you. Now here's the thing, remember, private discussion with the disciples, the apostles, and this is what Jesus tells them. Here's a real good pep talk for you. They will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you. And you will be hated by all nations because of my name. Doesn't that sound a little bit like what we just read a minute ago in verse 34, chapter 23? So they're warned ahead of time. Now, remember, this is at the end of Jesus' ministry. They've been with him for 3 years in this ministry. And he's letting them know, you're going to be delivered, you're going to be killed, and you're going to be hated. Now, most people, they're going to run from that. I mean, if this is what I'm signing up for, no thanks, let me move on. But they hear it, they listen, and of course they're faithful. But this is what's going to happen. Verse 10, at that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Same thing he said back in verses 4 and 5, isn't it? You got false prophets coming. And when he says false prophets, what's he meaning? These are people coming and claiming they're in the name of God. Okay? So make sure you understand that. They're claiming they're in the name of God, and they're going to mislead people. We'll get to why here shortly. And because lawlessness, verse 12, is increased, most people's love will grow cold. In other words, this is going to be a time where you're going into this great tribulation. People are suffering, and things are going to be so bad. They're going to be so bad that you finally become cold. There's no love for anyone anymore. You see how they'd be worn down. I hate you, and that's the idea. They're hating their neighbors. They're hating people around them. So this is a grim picture, isn't it? And I'd love to tell you it's going to get better. It's not. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Now, you will find that some, and I've had teachers in the past on both sides of the coin here. Some will say here, this is speaking about Judgment Day. This verse 13 and verse 14. Others that say no. I'm of the opinion that the answer is this is speaking still about the end of Jerusalem, destruction of Jerusalem, not Judgment Day. Here is why I think that, okay? Now, you may study it and come to a different conclusion and say, well, I think this applies to the second coming. Here's what you have to answer if you think that's the case. Number one, you have to answer, why is it that he speaks about the destruction of Jerusalem up to verse 12, then mentions Judgment Day, and then right back in verse 15, and remember, these verse numbers aren't there, so we go from one sentence to another sentence to the next sentence, and in between those sentences, he talks about final judgment, but the ones on either side of it, he's speaking about the destruction of Jerusalem. It doesn't make sense to me. Okay? Now, you may think otherwise. Come up with an answer. I'd love to hear it. Okay? Also, I pair Matthew 24:14 also with Colossians 1:6. Now, I may be wrong about this. I'm telling you up front. So write it down, do your own investigation. But he says this, that the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations. And then the end is going to come. In Colossians chapter 1 and verse 6, Paul there says this. Let me flip over there because I didn't actually plan on it, but this is extra. And it's important, I think. Colossians 1:6, if I can find it. There we go. In Colossians 1:6, Paul says this, speaking about the gospel. Because of the hope laid up for you, verse 5, in heaven, of which you previously heard in the word of truth, the gospel. Okay, listen what he says. Which has come to you, just as in all the world also, it's constantly bearing fruit and increasing, even as it has been doing in you since the day you heard of it and understood the grace of God and truth. So my thought is this, is that, and I think it fits with history, but just because it fits with history doesn't mean that I'm right here. So I'm just I'm giving you a sort of an asterisk to investigate on your own. When we look at history, I believe what Paul's saying here in Colossians 1 is that in this inhabited world, the gospel had spread throughout the inhabited world. And that the disciples all, if you aren't aware, the destruction of Jerusalem took place when? Do you remember? AD 70, okay? So Colossians were written about AD 63, 64, somewhere in that neighborhood, maybe a couple years earlier. That the gospel had spread throughout the world. And Jesus says that this end isn't going to come until that happens. And best I understand, if history is correct, okay, and it may not be, but that all except for John, all the apostles except for John died before AD 70. Horrible deaths. They were all martyred, again, with the exception of John, who history reveals to us. The scriptures don't reveal this to us. Died of old age in Ephesus. Okay. So, for me, because the clock is not my friend right now, I still think that this is the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay. Even if you go with the final judgment, answer the questions logically, and understand that there are still two different days being spoken of in this context. Now let's move on. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken to through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Now, where our friends will say, this is speaking about Judgment Day, we have to ask the question, right? Jesus says there's going to be a sign that you can see, right? The sign you can see is the abomination of desolation. That language may seem awkward to us, and it is. It comes from Daniel chapter 9. He says here, from what Daniel quoted, right? So Jesus tells us where to look. So we go back to Daniel chapter 9. You'll have to do that later on your own. And this is where he speaks about the 70 weeks and things like that. Jesus says that the abomination of desolation is applied to the destruction of Jerusalem. So that's how we understand it. And what does that mean? Luke tells us in Luke chapter 21. In other gospel accounts where Judgment Day is spoken of and the destruction of Jerusalem is spoken of, they are not in one place like it is in Matthew. You with me? Okay. In Luke's account, speaking about the destruction of Jerusalem, it's in Luke 21. And in Luke 21, instead of saying abomination of desolation, Luke says armies. Okay? Armies. He's speaking about armies. And so we can understand this language putting this all together. You with me? We could go deeper, and I would love to do that. But again, the time's on my side. So here's what you need to write down. Write down Luke 21:20. That helps you get a reference to what this means. You can write down Daniel chapter 9, Daniel 9:27, Daniel 11:31, and Daniel 12:11. So let me ask you something. This is just, and this is, I think, common sense. It should be common sense, right? God hopefully blessed us with some of that. Some not so much these days, feels like. But common sense is this. If Jesus says, here's a sign, right? And when you see the sign, what are you supposed to do according to verse 16? Flee the mountain. Flee, run, get out of here, right? Now, if this were the second coming, Judgment Day, where are you going to be able to run to get away from it? There's no place to go. You remember when we looked at the Revelation chapter 20 passage where he talked about Judgment Day. I think it's verse 11. I wrote it down here somewhere. Yeah, Revelation 20:11. You remember when the Lord comes, it says that heaven and earth tried to flee from his presence, but there's nowhere to go. You know, that's what we're talking about. So this can't be Judgment Day. This can't be final Judgment Day. Why is the Lord telling me, look for this, and when you do, run and hide? Okay? So write down next to that sign. This is what I've done in my Bible. I wrote sign, sign, sign. And here's what I'll do, in case you're not taking notes and you want this information. Because this is deep, okay? I'll send out a thing. I'll send it to Robin, and she can put it in the deal this week of these passages that show some of these things with a few notes to maybe help you in your own study. All right? So we got a sign here. And the sign is, when you see these things, it's time to book it. When you see armies surrounding, that's one of the signs. All right? Now let's move on, because, man, I hate the clock today. Here's what he says. Flee the mountains. Verse 17. Whosoever's on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whoever's in the field, don't go back to get your cloak. Woe to those who are pregnant, to those who are nursing babies in those days, and pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. Why all these things? Because when it's time to run, number one, you don't need to go back and gather stuff up. I'm telling you, when you see it, you better get out of here. I wonder how I would be in that situation. We get warnings like this sometimes. We see it practically speaking on TV all the time. Hurricane's coming. We're evacuating the city. Well, you know, maybe I'll stay, maybe I won't. We hesitate, we waffle. You know, what if Jesus says, when you see it, you need to run? I wonder how I would have been. I'm glad I don't have to worry about that. But he tells him you need to run. Now, don't go back in and get your coat. Don't go run back in to do anything else. And why pregnant and nursing babies? Why hope that it's not that? Practically speaking, if you're nursing a child, your flight is not going to be very quick. You know, I got a brand new grandbaby. Perfection, right? Perfection. But the amount of times that we go and we have to stop to make sure that baby's fed, it's like, we're never going to get there. You know, you can imagine. You can imagine if you need to run to the hills, right? If you're pregnant, obviously you're not going to be sprinting if you're pregnant. Why not in the winter, Sabbath day? Harder to run in the cold. You know, Sabbath day, the city gates are closed. You're not getting out of the city. Okay? So, now this next verse is important. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. If Jesus says that there's never been any tribulation this bad, nor there ever will, can we take that to the bank? Yeah, I'm sad that happened to them. I'm glad it's not going to happen to me. Right? So he says this is going to be unlike anything that's ever happened. Okay, we got a lot to cover. Let's read on. Unless, circle it, those days. And back in verse 19, circle it. I forgot to tell you, you got those days twice. Had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of who? The elect. Who is that? That's Christians, right? That's Christians. Those days will be cut short. So this tribulation could have lasted a lot longer, but because of Christians, God says, Jesus says, it's going to be shortened. Still the worst thing that's ever happened, but it's going to be shortened because of Christians. Now here's a place where we get a little sideways. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So, if they say to you, behold, he's in the wilderness, do not go out. Or, behold, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. So what do we have here? Jesus warning again what he warned at the beginning of this talk, right? About people being misled by false teachers and false Christ. Verse 11, he said it there. Again, false prophets are going to come. Here, it's interesting, he says that false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders. Now, I don't understand this completely, but I think these are real miracles that the false prophets were able to do. Here is why I think that. If you were to go to Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 4, this is the exact same language that's used to describe what Jesus and the apostles did. Okay? They're signs and wonders. All right? So you'll need to write that down and you need to investigate it. I may be wrong about it. But that's the way I understand it. The text. I don't understand it, how it works. Okay? But here's what I do understand. I understand that Jesus said that when these things happen, you do not believe them. Right? They can be very convincing. Write down in your notes, if you're taking notes, 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 4. In 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 4, we read about Satan, and Satan is referred to as the god of this world. And as the god of this world, he has blinded people to the truth. That's one of my daily prayers. Don't let me be blinded. I don't want to be blinded. I want to know this book, and it's what I want to live by. It's what I want to know. Don't let me be fooled. Some people were fooled, okay? But this is another sign. And Jesus says it this way in verse 27, just like lightning comes from the east, flashes to the west. Just so when you see lightning and you understand there's a storm coming and it's that visible, these things are going to be that recognizable. You're going to know it, okay? And when you see it, You need to run. Now, what does he mean when wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather? When these bad things happen, there are always people who are going to take advantage of those who maybe are innocent or naive or downtrodden. We see it. It's always been this way, hasn't it? You watch hurricanes or floods or fires in big towns. And what is the big problem that takes place a lot of times? We're going to go in, we're going to bust out the windows of them stores that got all that goodies, and we're going to go steal our stuff, right? We got vultures gathered around the carcasses, and the evil's going to be happening that's taking place there. And guess what? People are going to go take advantage of it. And so he's giving this warning. Now, verse 39. Oops, not verse 39, verse 29. I added 2 pages to my turn there. But immediately after the tribulation, now this is a difficult spot. We'll talk about it real quick. 29 through 31. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, circle that, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now, we've got a couple things here. We have some apocalyptic language, number 1. Number 2, if you were just reading this and we weren't having this study and you just picked this one verse out, that sounds like Judgment Day to me, right? That's what it sounds like to me. Again, I'm of the opinion that this isn't Judgment Day, that we're speaking about the destruction of Jerusalem with the same argument that I gave you before. Because in verse 32, he begins talking again about the destruction of Jerusalem. And right before this, he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. So it doesn't make sense to me to put it here. You may be of a different opinion. That's okay. Now, what about all this language here? The sun will be darkened. The moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky. Did that actually happen? This is language that's apocalyptic, okay? And in apocalyptic literature, which can be quite difficult and challenging sometimes language is used in exaggeration to emphasize the importance of a day. All right? That's what I believe we have here. So we saw it, we see it most notably for you and me in Acts chapter 2, when Peter says, this is what Joel prophesied about. And he uses language that's very similar to this. And so I believe Peter is pointing out there, as is the Lord here, this is apocalyptic literature emphasizing the significance of the day. Okay? Write down these passages if you're taking notes. Now I'll try to wrap this up. You got 5 minutes left. So hang with me. Okay? Write down these passages. Daniel 7:13. I appreciate those of you taking notes. I do. It helps you. Isaiah 19:1. Lamentations 2:1. And Ezekiel 30:18. Now, the reason I've given you those is this reason. To show you 4 different examples of apocalyptic literature that show what I've illustrated here, the importance of a day. Okay? So you can go look at those passages in their context and realize the actual things in the language didn't happen. They were emphasizing the importance of the event. You with me? Okay. So my thought is 29 through 31 still speaks of the destruction of Jerusalem. And we'll get more even so why as we wrap this up. Verse 32. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. This seems awkward to us, doesn't it? We got all this language and the Lord says, okay, now learn a parable from the fig tree. Well, anytime you get to a parable, there's a reason Jesus puts it there. He's trying to illustrate something to him. When its branches already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all what? These things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. And so, and probably you brethren here would know it far better than me. I'm not a farmer or a gardener. I kill everything I touch. But he's pointing out this very common knowledge to someone who is familiar with agriculture. These folks were. When you see leaves on a tree, you know that what comes next is fruit. And so just as easy it is for you to recognize that sign, you're going to be able to recognize the things I'm talking about. That's the point of the parable, okay? Now, here's what really nails it. And if you end up studying with someone, verse 34 is key. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all what? These things take place. See how that ties all that together? You know, you follow it through, keep it in the context, and Jesus says, this generation. Now we can take that to the bank, right? If Jesus says this generation is not going to pass till all this stuff happens, that's what's going to happen. How long after it did it happen? Roughly about 36, 37 years. Okay? This generation. Well, how certain is the Lord of it? Well, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Same phrase he used in verse 34. This is a certainty. You can take it to the bank. This place is going to be leveled and taken to the ground. And I've given you all these signs so you know. Now history, again, not Bible, okay? History says that Christians got out and that they didn't suffer. They paid attention to the teaching of Christ and they got out and survived. True for every one of them? I don't know. History says it did. You know, hopefully that's right. Nevertheless, Jesus gave all these signs. Now, this is going to be important for us as we move from verse 36 forward. I'm stopping here today. Don't worry. Okay? I'm stopping here now. But this is the first part of the chapter that very clearly talks about the destruction of Jerusalem and that those events have taken place. Now, what do we do with this? This isn't like, you know, a sermon where you feel good and you take something with you like some other sermons that apply to us. But I think there's some things we can do with it. Number one, we need to know this, okay? So anytime we're teaching the Word of God, we're not wasting anyone's time. If you study it, observe it, learn it, then we've done the right thing by God today, okay? Not only that, our friends don't know what we just went through, don't know the study we just had, okay? They need to be taught this and understand that there are no signs. That's what we're going to notice from verse 36 forward. There's no signs for what's coming. None. All right? So we need not confuse the two. I also realize this, and I take this away for my for this week, and that is this. As bad as things get in life, and if you're like me, the older you get, you sort of see the world getting worse and worse. Isn't that the way you feel sometimes? Yeah. It's never going to be and never going to get as bad for us as it did for our brethren in the first century. Never going to be that bad because Jesus said there's nothing worse that happened than that that's going to happen again. And our brethren got through it. His message to them was, he that endures till the end, right? That's something I can take with me this week, that no matter how bad it looks, and if you watch the news, I quit watching the news years ago. There's no good news, none. They prey on your fear, and then it works, right? I quit watching the news. But if you watch the news, it's never going to be this bad again, right? Never going to be this bad again. And my brethren overcame worse than anything I'll go through. And I know that heaven awaits them. They did it, we can do it. That's the point that I want to get across to you, okay? So I hope this is helpful to you. I do. If you are in need of the prayers of the church, we can help you in any way. You got questions about this afterwards, feel free to ask me. Again, I'll pass it off to these smart guys up front, and we'll do the best we can. But if you have a need to respond to the invitation, we do want to help you. We really genuinely care about you and have a concern for you. And if we can help you in any way, let us know right now while Dylan leads us in the song. Won't you stand while we sing?